Hi, Cynthia. Hi, Marie. Hi, Anna. Just to confirm, can you guys hear me? Great, thank you. We have about 5 minutes to go, everyone, until we get started. So feel free to sit back and relax. And we'll get going probably just a couple of minutes after 1 to make sure that people have the opportunity to sign in. Thank you, Alyssa. It's schnauzers, and I have two schnauzers. Hi, everyone. We are waiting just a few minutes for extra people to hop on. We will get started in just a few minutes. Thank you, Annie. I have two schnauzers. I am a certifiable crazy schnauzer lady. I'm quite happy to wear that mantle. We'll get started in just a couple, well, probably about 1 minute, guys. I'm going to give people just a few more seconds to hop on. Thanks, Christy. Hey, shoot me an email, actually. I want to know where you ended up at. All right, guys, it is 1:05, so we are going to go ahead and get rolling. Yeah, thanks, Christy. For anybody who happens to be in the central Illinois area who heard the big boom about what, an hour and 25 minutes or so ago, just in case anybody's wondering, from what we're hearing right now, it sounds like it was in fact a sonic boom. So no need to be concerned about safety for anybody or anything along those lines. So that's good to know. I am going to be doing this solo, so I'm not going to have anybody else helping to man any of the chat boxes or anything. So if you guys could do me a huge favor, if you need to send me a message, or if you have questions or comments, which I strongly encourage, please do not hesitate to do so. Make sure that you put them in the chat bar, and then also make sure that you have it selected so that your message is being sent to everyone. There's a drop-down menu towards the bottom, and you can send it to hosts and panelists, everyone, and then it lists everybody's name in the world there. Just put everyone, so that if someone has a question or a comment, we can all see what it is that they've said, so that it doesn't sound like I'm just talking to myself, even though I kind of am. So let's go ahead and, hi Suzette, talk a little bit today about trauma-informed care, validation, and compassion fatigue. This is a training I've done plenty of times. It's a topic that I have a lot of passion for. I think it's super, super important for us to all have a pretty significant knowledge base in this, because it really impacts not only how we work with the individuals we are lucky enough to work with, but also how we treat one another. And it's something that really helps us just be better people. Panelists and attendees, Nadia, that's perfect. Yeah, that works too. Mine might say something a little different because I'm one of the hosts. So for a little bit of background on me, so that everybody who doesn't know who I am has that info. My name is Katie Doctor. I am a specialist in school psychology as well as a BCBA. I have worked for ICPN for, I think I'm at 9.5 years at this point, so a minute or two. And I have worked in the school system as well, and certainly doing what I do with ICPN, I see lots and lots and lots of different things. So feel free to ask questions, feel free to interrupt, tell me your personal stories, that's fine. I really prefer when we're able to do these interactive and in person, but obviously we all understand right now that it is just not the safest option. So we're trying to offer lots of trainings remotely so that hopefully people are still able to get their CEUs and information. And honestly, sometimes just get a break from the day-to-day stuff that we're all dealing with and need a break now and then. I believe that Anna sent out the training earlier to everyone. If you did not get it, what I'm going to do is at the end of the training, I'm going to put an email address in the chat box, and that's Anna Bavanti. She's our training coordinator. If you show her an email, she will get you the training. She's also the person that will be managing CEUs. So typically it takes us about 2 weeks to get them to you. With the holidays, it might take a little bit longer, so please do your best to be patient. And after that point in time, if you don't have them, you can go ahead and email Anna. Or if you have my email address and you know me, you can feel free to email me as well. That's fine. We can get you those, but it might just take a little bit longer than normal because a lot of us are trying to take some well-deserved time off. Okay, let's really get into trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is really incredible when it's put into practice, when it is in fact something that we are working on as an entire group. And it is not some regimented super, super specific sort of step-by-step process, but really it's more of an overall approach or philosophy to treatment. And what we're doing is we're emphasizing someone's personal history and how that may impact who they are, how they behave, and what they're like as a person. And we also try and work on how that person's trauma affects them, not only to give them better skills to manage it, but then also to make our environment more reasonable for them to live within and help them. Okay, so it's not something that is very prescriptive, and it is not at all a step-by-step situation. But I think that's a huge benefit to trauma-informed care, simply because we're really working on trying to be more person-centered, right? We don't want these cookie-cutter plans and goals for people. We really want to work on how is it that we support individuals to have the best possible lives, full lives that meet what they need and what we need from a paperwork standpoint. And trauma-informed care can really help with that, because we can write goals and help people work on things that are meaningful for them and then impact their life in a big way. And like I said, that aren't specific, that are specific to one person and not generic, because those generic goals really aren't that helpful. It would be like if each one of us had the same exact goals in our job performance every year. It wouldn't make any sense. We need to have different ones. So trauma-informed care really makes things individualized. I think before we even really hit hard any of what trauma-informed care is, I need to make sure that we're all aware of what trauma is, because that's the heart of all of this. Trauma is extremely individualized. It is not in any way, shape, or form generic, right? It is different for each one of us. And the reality is every single one of us could actually be in a situation and have different levels of trauma associated with it, meaning you could have trauma that is incredibly intense to no trauma at all, having experienced the exact same thing, because our learning history plays a huge role in how we handle trauma and what is or isn't trauma for us. Trauma is just, a set of circumstances or even a specific event that leaves us feeling sort of raw and vulnerable. It's not uncommon at all for people who have had trauma to actually sort of revisit that trauma. When I think about this, I think a lot about people who are in the military and people who have PTSD, where they may legitimately have flashbacks, and experience that situation all over again. I'm sure most of us know at least one person, particularly individuals in the military, who have had situations happen like this. And what happens is trauma never really fully goes away. It actually can change the wiring in our brain. And so we may experience times when that trauma sort of comes to the surface again and again and again. And the intensity that it comes back can vary significantly based on the situation that we find ourselves in. It might be one of those scenarios where that there's a certain situation that's triggering for you, and you're able to work through it before it becomes difficult again. And then there might be times where you've experienced some level of trauma that is so significant that if you experience one of those triggers, you go right back to that really intense place where you were before. So like I said, you're feeling very raw and very vulnerable. And that's very important to know, because I think it's so easy for us to not understand the trauma of others, because we're all so wrapped up in our own things right now, because the world is bananas at the moment and has been for the better part of 2 years. And so it's hard for us at times to take that step back and think about what happened to this person and why are they reacting this way, and what is it that we can do differently to maybe make this situation a little bit better. Nobody's trauma is exactly the same, and nobody's going to react in exactly the same way. So it's really important for us to know the signs and the symptoms of trauma and what that can look like and feel like for people, so that we are able to maybe recognize it and work with people to hopefully help them get through the more difficult times, because trauma, like I said, it never truly goes away, but we may be able to mitigate some of the things that go along with it. So signs and symptoms of trauma, there's quite a few here, and we're going to talk about them, and I'll also bring in personal stories from individuals that I've worked with in the past, and maybe even some of my own stuff, we'll see. But I think there's a couple of things when we talk about signs and symptoms to be careful of. These are not exclusive. This list could be way longer. And in fact, I have a second slide, but even then it's certainly not exhaustive. The signs and symptoms can vary in intensity, in frequency, in duration. And it's important for us to be sure that we are not over pathologizing. So just because someone may have some of these things doesn't necessarily mean it's trauma. It can be, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is. So we just need to be a little cautious and really look at someone through that very intense big lens, not just one or two behaviors when we're trying to assess for trauma. So signs and symptoms. One thing is new disruptive behaviors may appear suddenly. People may have attention-seeking behaviors because inherently when you are feeling traumatized or you're in the throes of that situation, you want to feel safe. That is the goal, is to feel safe, to feel protected. And so you might seek out attention from specific people who make you feel safe, who you know you can be vulnerable with. You might actually see reoccurrence of old behaviors that you thought had sort of been extinguished, but they may come back. That happens too. People will sometimes have nightmares and flashbacks, and they may start to have some psychosomatic things as well, or just some somatic complaints, stomach aches, back pain, headaches. All of those things can happen, along with sleeplessness and a difficulty concentrating, a lack of energy, an excessive fear of others, and then maybe repetitious statements about something that is important to them, maybe we don't understand. And I think what is something that we always have to remember with the individuals that we serve is we are all able to discuss our trauma. We are all able to talk about what we feel inside, not only emotions, but the physiological symptoms that sometimes go along with trauma. But that's not always a skill set that is as well developed with the individuals that we work with. Some of them may not be able to utilize words in the same way as us to tell us what's going on. They may not have the skill set to really relay that information to us. So if you've got someone who is really verbal and an accurate reporter and has just such a great skill set in that area, it's wonderful, right? It makes our jobs a bit easier because we're able to say, okay, we can talk to this person and work through it. But some of the individuals that we work with inherently aren't going to have those skills. So we have to sort of put on our detective hats and really look at what's going on with that person and try and have an idea of what might have happened to them. And if they're starting to have some big bad behaviors that we don't want to see, what could those behaviors be a reaction to? So I'm going to try and think of, let's see, I'll be talking several times about some young ladies that I've worked with over the years. They're just really clear examples that always just are so salient in my mind. But we're going to talk about one lady, and I won't use names, of course, or I'll give them false names, but excessive fear of others. There was a woman that I worked with a couple of years ago, and 99.9% of the time she was delightful. She was great at her group home. She didn't really have any family. She had an OSG guardian, but her home was really her family. She'd been there for many, many years. Her staff adored her, but she was starting to have some pretty significant difficulties in her DT setting. And so we got called in as SST. We did our intake, we did some observations. And one of the things that I always try and do is do a deep dive into someone's history, because that can really give you some information. And unfortunately, some of this woman's history wasn't readily available. So we started getting releases and trying to really deep dive into more material about her, because it was just so strange what she was doing. Essentially, what we were able to come to at the end with her was she was physically assaulting staff. And it was very specific circumstances with her. And it should be noted as well that she had some early signs of dementia. And people with dementia sometimes are not living in the moment now. Maybe they're living years and years ago, right? So that's important to know. But she would assault staff, but only DT. And as we came to really deep dive into her incident reports and just dig for as much detail as we could possibly find, we found out that she would only attack staff if they approached her from behind or from the sides. If people approached her from the front, if people had her attention, if they said her name, no problem. There was never an issue. But if you approached her from behind or the side, and particularly if you touched her before you absolutely were sure that you had her attention, you were highly likely to get hurt. She was highly likely to be physically aggressive. And despite the fact that she utilized a wheelchair for movement and the fact that she was a slightly older person, she definitely knew how to use her physical skill set in order to get people to back off. And so we got more information on her and found out that unfortunately her life was one where she had been the victim of repetitive sexual assault. And not by just one person, it had happened many times in her life. And from what we were able to gather from people who had known her for many, many years ago, her assaulters, and there were multiple gentlemen, would always approach her from behind and the sides to hold her down. And so we were able to put those pieces together that let us know that probably what was happening with her was, as people were approaching her from the sides and behind, it was reminding her of those horrific incidents in her life where she had no control, where she was being victimized in one of the worst ways that I can possibly imagine. And so her response was to assault others. And to me, it made perfect sense, right? If that was my life, if that had been my learning history, if that was the way that I was able to protect myself, you better believe I'd do the same thing. So we worked with her DT, and unfortunately we weren't able to really make as much success there as I hoped, but she found a new DT. And one of the things that I did is, before she even got there, before she even started there, we took the time to have a meeting with the DT staff, and as many of the staff as we could, not just the ones that were going to be working with her specifically, but everyone that we could, and just let them know about that bit of her history, because that bit of her history was very significant to her behaviors. And we had actually spoken to her house staff as well, and they were all like, oh yeah, everybody knows. You make sure you've got her attention first. You never approach her from behind or the side. And even if you approach her from the front, you keep some distance and make sure she has looked at you and responded to you. And then you tell her, hey, I'm going to help you with this, and this is how I'm going to touch you, or things along those lines, so that she knew exactly what was going to be happening. But she had an excessive fear of others a lot of the times if you approached her and she didn't know you were coming, because of her trauma history. Judy, I'm not sure that we can assume it's a memory or a tragedy around the holidays, but it's definitely worth looking into. I would need to know more about the situation, to be honest with you. You know, did they go home? Was it their first trip home during COVID? Were certain family members no longer there? You know, there's a lot of little things that could be going on with that individual. Were there medication changes, house staff changes? Because I know the staffing shortage is critical everywhere. There's a lot of other variables that I would consider not just trauma, but it could be trauma, definitely. And the holidays in general, right? We are how many days away from Christmas? 3-4 days, right? Plus we've already had Hanukkah, the New Year is coming up, Thanksgiving. We are in year 2 of a global pandemic. I think it's fair to say that a lot of us are sort of on edge these days, right? Even the holidays in general, you might have all of your ducks in a row. You might have all of your gifts already in your hot little hands and not sitting, you know, off the shore somewhere unbeknownst to you, but we may all be struggling right now. So individuals in general tend to have a bit more difficulty during the holiday season, especially our second set of holidays that are going to be impacted. So anyway, the first woman I spoke about, we were able to get her to a new DT. Her staff there were incredible. Everybody knew what was going on with her, and everybody followed the plan exactly as prescribed, and it was incredible. She did great. But it was that knowing her trauma, knowing her signs and symptoms, and knowing how she reacted that made a huge impact for her, which is great. So some other signs and symptoms of trauma. Someone can appear to be distracted. I don't know if any of you have ever heard about like a dissociation, or if anyone here has ever driven home from work or driven to work and sort of got to the parking lot or your garage and thought, I legitimately don't know how I got here. That can be disassociation. And sometimes that can be trauma, where you're just trying to process something, or you're trying to work through the events of the day. And certainly individuals that we work with can be experiencing that too. People can have very phobic mannerisms and understandably avoid triggers. I know that triggers are one of the words right now that we hear a lot, and that might feel a bit overused, but if you've ever yourself been in a situation where you were just so clear in your mind that that was traumatic for you, that that was a difficult situation, triggers can be very, very real. I know that I've been through some things in my life. And I'll be honest, there was a very specific make and model and color of a car that if I happen to see it, I have to work on getting myself calm, because otherwise I am very triggered. And what happens to me specifically is I start to feel extremely unsafe emotionally. I feel very panicky. My heart starts to race. I have a difficult time breathing, basically sort of go into a very light panic attack. But it's important for us to know those things, because if I can avoid feeling that way, heck yeah, I'm going to do it. So it makes sense that individuals might try and avoid those triggers, because the rest of us would too. People might have some self-soothing behaviors, maybe a decline in their skill development as well. In particular, one that's important to note, I think, is it actually goes along with the onset of bedwetting or bowel accidents. Sexual assault and sexual abuse within the population of individuals we work with is rampant. Anywhere from 40 to 70% of our individuals are victims. And so those are things that we often see, particularly the onset of bedwetting and bowel accidents after someone has had some experience with sexual assault. So that's important to know. And people might have questions that seem to come out of nowhere that just don't make sense, particularly if you were talking to them and then there's just right turn to a totally different topic that makes you think, what just happened here? It could be that they're thinking about some past trauma and they're asking you questions for reassurance. And people might have changes in sleep and eating patterns. They might become socially isolating as well, and irritable. Now, if you look through any of these symptoms and thought, wow, a lot of these appear to be things that are related to depression or anxiety, you are correct. A lot of times people who have experienced trauma go through periods of depression and anxiety. A lot of these things very much correlate to one another. So, like I said earlier, yeah, Anna, it's so hard. Yeah, Anna said that she ventures that the rate of sexual abuse is more than 70% because our individuals are so vulnerable. And it's true. And the hardest thing is that so many of our individuals are not able to accurately describe or tell us what has happened. We sort of have to guess. We sort of have to, put together some pieces and hope that we have figured out the puzzle correctly. And certainly our individuals, a lot of them are the perfect victims. And I say perfect not because I'm encouraging this in any way, shape, or form, but if we're looking at, trying to find victims, our individuals can be pretty easy to victimize, not only because some of them don't have the skill set to tell us what they have experienced, but then some of them are not exactly accurate reporters. We have individuals who will constantly make false allegations. Those people are actually really good victims because people don't tend to believe them anyway. So if they say for the 100th time something that didn't happen, maybe it did actually happen and this time it's real. The boy who cried wolf kind of a scenario that can be hard. Which takes us into what sort of trauma is common for the individuals that we work with. Neglect is huge. And I want to be clear, this is in all potential settings, certainly not just exclusively within a family home or a group home or anywhere. This is everywhere. We know individuals who have been locked in a bedroom or a closet and had extreme deprivation in all areas of their lives. People who were just parked in front of the television all day long, that's neglectful as well. I mean, I'm all about hanging out in front of the TV and sitting in front of Netflix for a couple of hours to zone out now and then. But if that's been your whole life, that's definitely not appropriate. That's neglectful. Malnutrition is quite common in individuals. And one thing that isn't inherently neglect, but certainly could be, is just transitions across caretakers. When there are so many people involved in caring for someone, sometimes things fall through the cracks, even with the very best of staff, which could end up leading to some type of neglect. Physical abuse, it can be extremely common as well. Violence from caregivers, unfortunately, is not something that any of us are probably unfamiliar with. And sometimes our individuals, particularly those who are out in the community and have community time or elope, and don't tend to stay in their group homes, they could be the target for violent crimes. I've had a couple of individuals living in neighborhoods that maybe aren't the safest, and you will actually see Facebook posts of our individuals in dangerous situations, even involved in gang violence sometimes. Emotional abuse is certainly rampant as well. I think most of us have probably had an experience with bullying at some point in our lives, but I think it's a very fair thing to say that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a much higher rate of that, as well as those things lasting for a longer period of time than just sort of the typical kids picking on kid kind of stuff. They might also have rejection from caregivers and mistreatment from caretakers as well. Our system now is radically different than it was even 30, 40 years ago. Even when I was young and in school, I know that we didn't see nearly as many individuals who had, looks like we had a couple of folks raise your hand. Please do me a favor and just write what you want in the chat box. I'm not going to be able to check out the hand raising and the chat box alone. So if you can just write what you wanted to write in the chat box, even if it's just to me, that would be great. Thank you. So a lot of the individuals that we work with, because they have had so many caretakers and inherently their needs might be more intense than, say, like the typical individual, they might experience more abuse and rejection from caregivers. And again, sexual abuse, it is rampant, unfortunately, within this population. It's just, it's really sad. And so a lot of times we are left to sort of guess, what has this person gone through? What is it that they have experienced? We need to try and figure it out so that we can help them, because that's why we're all here. Every single one of us wants to help individuals lead a better life. So what are the effects of trauma? What can this really do to all of us? Because that's really important too. If trauma didn't affect us, we wouldn't be having any of this today. The first thing is a persistent fear response. And when you are in that place of trauma, when you are in that place of heightened response, any stimulus that is like the one that is a trigger for you could actually be triggering. So earlier I talked about how there's a specific make and model and color of a car that is hard for me because of my own history. It's a black car, right? But if I were to see that make and model when I was already triggered, and even if it was a slightly different color, let's say navy blue, I might be triggered even further because of that, because I'm already at that point where I'm a little heightened in my sensitivity, and then it can go even further, and that fear response is more intense, which also goes along with hyperarousal, right? So you're extra careful about all of these other cues that are in the environment, things that normally are no big deal, right? If someone makes eye contact with you or touches you, and especially even if it's someone that you know and you trust, and them doing those things is no big deal to you, if you're already hyper aroused, if someone does those things to you, you might respond far more intensely than you typically would, because you're already super aroused, and you are more likely to misinterpret those cues. And you might also internalize all of that stress, which actually changes how your brain functions. And it can really assist, unfortunately, in the development of depression and anxiety. So when you have trauma and when you are currently experiencing it, all of these things can be happening. So it makes sense that when someone is experiencing trauma and when they are currently living in it, whether it's currently going on in the moment or it's a flashback or something triggered them in the environment, all of these things can come back. Sometimes they come back at the highest level, the most intense level. Sometimes they're only a little bit. And sometimes you're able to manage them very easily, other times not. A lot of this is very internal. So it's not necessarily something that you're going to be able to see clearly unless you know that person well. Other effects, diminished executive functioning. Executive functioning is just that whole part of our brains that really helps us plan ahead, get things done, and not be a mess, for sort of a nicer way to put it at the moment. So executive functioning is what allows you to get up in the morning, get dressed, get to work, do all the things you need to do successfully, just to, let's say, get to work. If you are having a hard time with your executive functioning, you might forget to do a couple of things on your way out the door, or forget things you know you needed to take, or things along those lines. That can be something that would happen. It can actually lower your academic achievement because you can't be focused on academics at that moment. It could lead to some short-term and long-term intellectual impairments, decreased IQ, and a weakened ability to maintain attention. Also, delayed developmental milestones, particularly due to neglect. Those can lead to very weakened neural pathways. And it also makes you less responsive to positive reinforcement. And this is something we see a ton, again, with people who have been sexually assaulted. A lot of times we will see someone who has been through that, has actually been through that grooming process, where someone, the person who is the perpetrator, gradually over time builds this relationship with the other person to the point where they eventually do take advantage and then go ahead and sexually assault. And part of that is lots and lots of reinforcement. There's typically gift giving, special attention. And so if you have gone through that process of being groomed and then someone starts to give you that sort of attention and rewards and reinforcement that's positive, you're going to be less likely to respond as intensely because your learning history states that this particular set of behaviors from that other person could lead to that sexual assault. So people may not seem to appreciate all of that extra reinforcement that you're giving, but it might not be you. It might be their learning history. People might also misread social cues. They may be aggressive or defensive. And I worked with a young woman who, she's another really, really excellent example of how trauma-informed care helped her life a lot. She's a great young lady. She was pretty darn independent as well, which was great, but she was very young. She was in her early 20s. And when we first met her, she was referred for a number of behaviors. But one of the things that became pretty evident after we met her was that staff complained quite a bit of her lack of personal hygiene, and that she would often wear pretty much every single article of clothing that she owned every single day, and wasn't great about washing that clothing either. So not only her own person wasn't very clean, but neither was her clothing. And so we really had to get to the bottom of what was happening there. And intermittently, she would also go ahead and urinate and defecate on herself, despite the fact that she was very independent in both of those areas and no medical difficulties. So it took a long time for her to trust any of us, to open up to any of us. And while we tried, again, we went back to the paperwork. We did a deep dive in her records. We really tried to gather all the info that we could. And again, found out that this was a young woman who, I believe it was her mother's boyfriend or her stepfather. And I'm sorry, I can't remember which, it's been so long. But he had repeatedly raped her. And so part of what she was doing was setting herself up and giving herself coping skills so that she would be less likely to be a victim. She didn't typically physically assault people unless she was super, super angry, which wasn't related to the sexual assault at all. But she would wear all of her clothing, because it's really, really hard for someone to sexually assault you if you're wearing all of your clothing. It takes a long time for that to be taken off. And she also made sure that her fragrance wasn't necessarily one that people would enjoy, because again, people don't come as close to you physically if you don't smell great, right? Even if someone's breath isn't great in the moment, you might take a step back. She was doing that for herself so that she could be safe. She also misread social cues, particularly from males. She really did not work well with men. And so we had to train her male staff quite a bit on how to work with her differently so that she wasn't as likely to yell at them or throw things at them, those kind of things. And so we had to be really cautious with her. And we eventually were able to work on some interventions that really helped make her life a lot better. But initially, because her staff didn't necessarily know what her history was, they were understandably just really frustrated working with her, because she wouldn't let them wash her clothing. She didn't do her hygiene tasks. She smelled. So staff left feeling like they smelled as if she did. And she wasn't necessarily a very friendly person. So they didn't want to work with her. And again, I don't blame them. But once we were able to teach them about her history and work with her on some different coping skills, it did change quite a bit, which is wonderful. And that's kind of the whole point of all of this, is that we want to learn that person's history. We want to understand what it is that that person has experienced and gone through so that we can make their life better. And so trauma-informed care is just a set of principles Again, it's not prescriptive per se, and it's not like a step-by-step process, but we need to know what the needs are of the person themselves and what they've been through in their life. What is their history? What might actually be difficult for them to work through because of what they've experienced. And what we are trying to do with trauma-informed care is make that person's life comfortable and safe before we do anything else. Because that is our bare minimum, right? That is our baseline, is everyone should be able to feel comfortable and safe. Because if you don't feel that way, none of the rest of the stuff that we're all trying to work on to actually better someone's life is going to happen. So comfortable and safe is our very, very, very bare minimum, right? That's the basement of what we want. And then we can build once those things are achieved. But we need to know that person's history first and how that trauma has affected them and what behaviors they might engage in because of that trauma so that we can work on those things. And trauma-informed care is used so many different places. It's certainly not a brand new concept. And I'm sure that all of you looking at wherever it is that you work and what you do probably see some of this already happening. We want to work more on it. So what are the core steps for trauma-informed care? Karen, we did a lot of different things with her. We gave her a lot more freedom and we gave her a lot more control over her life. We ended up putting extra additional locks on her doors because we were able to get her to a point where she wasn't self-harming. We had figured out some things there, but we gave her more control over her life. When it was time for her to take a shower, only female staff were in the house so that she didn't feel as unsafe, but she had extra locks on the doors that only she and female staff had the keys to, and that was really helpful for her. We did a lot of therapy, and I mean a lot of therapy. And I think we also tried and successfully were able to get a washer and dryer just for her room so that she could wash her clothing sort of on her own schedule. And eventually we're able to get her to wear less clothing at a time. So it was easier for her to do some laundry while she still had some clothing on. And I'll be honest, I haven't worked with her in so many years. She may be still doing really great. She may be struggling. I haven't heard her name. So my fingers are crossed she's doing well because she was such an incredible young woman. But we did a lot of little things. And this woman was very, very verbal and high functioning. So we worked a lot with her for her to tell us what she wanted and what she needed. Because anything that we would have put in place, she might not have liked. So it was important to get the buy-in with her. So the core steps. First one is understand and realize the impact of trauma on that person. Like I said, trauma is different for every single one of us. And what I consider to be traumatic might be different than what you consider to be traumatic, but neither one is wrong and neither one is right. I recently had a situation where an individual of mine was in fact physically assaulted by her staff. And unfortunately, someone else within the agency was able to, I believe, review video of the incident, but then said, oh, it wasn't that bad. It shouldn't be traumatic for her. That person is allowed to feel that way and have that lens, but they're not the person that was being abused. They're not the person that then had to be with that staff on a regular basis and work with that staff. So even if we don't think something was traumatic, doesn't mean it wasn't for that individual. And it is extremely important for us to be aware that our version of trauma and other people's are not the same. Second thing is we need to recognize those signs and symptoms. We need to do that through lots of observation and evaluation. And I think this is where sometimes things are a little bit hard because this requires a lot of work, and I won't even deny it. But it really does, because this is where we have to gather all of that information about that person. This is where we have to actually go and watch the person in their environment, in multiple environments, and see what on earth is going on with them and discern what is it in this situation that makes it hard for them to behave in a way that is what we would consider typical for that person. And then also having conversations with staff is huge, I may know some things about behavior. I may have some fancy letters behind my name that say I know stuff about behavior, but I will never know that individual as well as that person's staff, because the DSPs are the ones who are in there day in and day out. They know that person in a way that I will never, ever know them. So that's why it's so critical to talk to everyone in the organization, including DSPs, and also establish a good rapport with DSPs so that they will be more upfront and honest with you. If I only show up every once in a while and don't have a rapport at all, they're not going to talk to me. I'm just some random person. So we have to do that. It's really, really important. And we also have to respond to that person by integrating what we know about them into their treatment planning. We have to actually make sure that the information that we gather gets into their paperwork. So for the young lady that I talked about earlier, she wasn't super young, but the woman in the wheelchair who would physically assault staff that came up from behind or on the side, we had to put it in her plan multiple places, clearly in bold. This is how you interact with her. Do not do these things. And I strongly encourage you, and I assume that most of you who are here today are not DSPs, that you're Qs or administrators or clinicians or management. It is so critical that staff actually know these things about the individuals they are working with. And not just that you tell them once, but that this is something that is routinely reviewed and that it has made its way into their paperwork many, many places, so that there's no chance of it getting lost. There's no chance of that person's information just being pushed to the side like it doesn't matter. Those things are really important. And then what we have to do is try to not re-traumatize people. If anyone here has been through trauma, there is nothing fun about going through it again. It's horrible. It can really sort of take you out of your game for a minute, much less a couple of days, depending on what the situation is. So we want to create that safe and low stress environment that meets the needs of that individual. So it's important that we do all of that. So why trauma-informed care? I mean, hopefully I don't have to sell you guys on this, but just in case someone hasn't bought what I'm selling quite yet, it's not a procedure, it's a philosophy. And it has to come from the top of an organization all the way down. Everyone has to buy into this because we need to understand that what we are doing to that individual and then also to one another is extremely impactful. And I think that's something that has just become that much more clear during the pandemic, is that each one of us has been through God knows what in the last 18 months. And some things have been especially really, really hard. And so if you know your coworkers well, if you know the people that you are working with most often well, you know signs for them that they're not okay. Or you might know things that are a bit triggering for them. I have certain staff, they can walk in and I can tell by the way that their feet are falling on the carpet, whether or not they're okay. And that is so helpful because it helps me know how to interact with them in a way that is supportive so that they feel safe, right? So that they can get back to that, that lower level basement so that then we can build upon it for a better day. Because if someone walks in and they're already at a point where they're triggered or escalated, they're not going to be able to handle the tough stuff that is inevitably going to cross their desk that day. The other thing about trauma-informed care that I think is so, so critical is that it is sort of that next wave in this evolution of getting people out of institutions and giving the individuals that we work with a life that is very much worth living and a quality of life that we would be willing to accept for ourselves. Institutionalization is a part of our history that we all have to be aware of. We have to know, because that affects the individuals that we're working with who had spent significant periods of their life in institutions, the good and the bad of those institutions, because some of them are fantastic and provided great services, but we all know some of the horror stories that unfortunately have occurred as well. So as we're trying to get people who are ready to live in the community, better community services, this is sort of that next step. And most states are way ahead of the game, unfortunately, from Illinois. We are pretty far behind compared to some other states. So this is sort of that next wave of things that we need to be working on, so that as we work more and more and more on getting people out into the community and giving them the services they need to be successful in the community, that we're aware of their trauma and how to work with it. It also recognizes that everyone has value, no matter who you are. No matter who you are, you have value, you can contribute. And that abusive treatment and traumatic experiences have very long-term effects. And those effects may go away for a long time and then someday come back, right? They could reoccur. Trauma-informed care is a big push within the ABA community as well. And speaking as someone who is a BCBA and has taken time to learn, certainly not all of ABA's history, but a lot of it, we are a group as well that is really working on talking about what within our practices need to change, because we are certainly not without fault in many areas. And we are working harder every single day on providing interventions for individuals that really give them so much more freedom of choice and an opportunity to tell us what they want and need. And trauma-informed care goes along with that, because we're trying to always teach people new skills and better skills that help them have their best life. We're going to take a quick little path down some jargon, but I am not going to stay here for long because I'll be honest, jargon doesn't serve any purpose. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, but we're going to gloss over it because you don't need to know the specific terms. So I'm not going to waste your time. We talk within behavior analysis, we talk about motivating operations and setting events. And these are things that could be internal feelings that don't necessarily show, but that people are certainly experiencing. Behavior analysis has really changed over the years. We've gone from thinking if you didn't see it, it didn't happen, to obviously every individual that we work with is perfectly capable of having the full range of emotions that we have and experiences that typical people have. So we talk about these motivating operations and setting events as things that are internal within people. So if you have a situation where someone says to you, well, the behavior came out of nowhere, sometimes that is possible because the behavior is actually coming from something happening within that person that we can't see, that we can't fully understand because we're not in their body, because we're never going to have a full understanding of what it is that they are thinking and feeling at any given time. So we look at those things and try and take those into account once we look at the entire environment as well and try and rule those things out first. So within motivating operations, we look for the stimuli that were paired with the trauma, and those things are triggers. So what we might see is if someone experiences that stimuli, they are triggered, and then the motivating operation is that next part that actually helps people determine what their behavior is going to be, either behavior that is helpful or not helpful. And triggers also elicit the emotions, right? If you've ever been through a traumatic experience, those emotions are really tough, right? They can weigh on you very, very heavily. So that's something we need to be aware of. And trauma creates a state of deprivation because at that moment, all you care about is being safe. That is all you want, right? Anything to keep yourself safe. So you're not worried about any of the bigger stuff in your life. If anybody's ever looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We're talking about the basic necessities of life, food, water, shelter, and the rest of the stuff doesn't matter in that moment. There's no point even thinking about it. So if our needs aren't met, or if we are in a state of dealing with that trauma or having experienced a trigger, all the other stimuli in the environment is either going to be sort of ignored by our body in that moment, or it's going to be hyperarousal. And so it becomes really, really difficult. And some people might go ahead and engage in some pretty extreme behaviors in order to find a way to mitigate everything that it is they're feeling and that they're thinking. And again, especially for individuals who don't have necessarily the skill set to tell us what it is that they are experiencing or the way that they feel, it can really lead to some pretty intense behaviors, particularly self-injury, right? Because that's when it's really, really hard and it can be really devastating for everyone. So moving on from some of the more jargony bits. So if you have a BCBA that ever uses any of those terms, you have a little info, but I'll be honest, I really try not to. It's not super useful. So what are triggers? Just to make sure we have an idea of what this is and what our reaction to triggers could be. Typically, they're survival responses that are automatic, but they may have provided some type of escape in the past. And most of us have probably heard of fight and flight, but there's also a third one that we might experience, which is freeze. And gosh, I had a person who used to work here, and she is a huge fan of Halloween and being scared. And she and her family often go to haunted houses. And it was funny to talk to her about all of this because she would often go with her sister and her brother, and all three of them reacted to things that truly scared them in three completely different ways. And they were the ways listed on this slide. So, and for the life of me, I can't remember which sibling did which, but we'll just say that she was the one who would fight. She'd be likely to come at the person who was in that haunted house and physically try and keep herself and her family safe. And then one of her siblings would just run through the haunted house as quickly as they could. Just get me out of here. That's all I can do. And then there was a third sibling that would legitimately like crumple to the floor in a ball and freeze and just not be able to do anything else. And so we might see all of those things within the individuals that we work with. And if you really think about yourself, you can probably figure out which of these you are more likely to engage in and which you are more likely to do. And it's funny to also know that about the individuals that you work with as well as your staff. I am very much a flight person or a freeze. I'm not a fighter. It's not my strength, but I have some people in my life who are really good at the fight part. A situation comes up and man, they're ready, right? They're ready to take it on. And that does not work for me. It is not a good situation for me. So knowing those things about yourself, as well as the individuals that you work with, can be really helpful. Because if you start to see those behaviors, if you start to see those responses, you know, okay, we have to take a step back from whatever it is that is happening right now, because it's not going to get us anywhere good. If we push further, we're only going to be re-triggering people. We're only going to be putting back into that traumatic situation again. This is not what we want. So we might have situations where a client who has experienced some type of neglect overreacts or has a huge intense reaction when told no, especially for individuals who have experienced pretty significant deprivation, especially over food. Food is one that we see a lot. So if you have an individual who hoards food or has a stockpile of snacks, hidden snacks that nobody knows about in their bedroom, it might be that they were deprived of food in their past. And so if staff tries to clear that out or take it away, or if they're only allowed to have food in very, very specific situations, that can be really difficult for them because they have food insecurity. They're afraid they're not going to have enough to eat. So there's ways you can start to work around those things. Somebody who engages in some form of SIB to escape those social situations. If you happen to have a conversation with someone or work with a client and they start hitting themselves, you know, us as staff, we might try and back off or get away from that person because we don't know what's happening and we don't know how to help them. Certainly as someone who travels to a lot of different settings, I don't know many of the individuals that are in that setting, especially like a big DT. I'm there for that one person and I may not know anybody else in that setting. And so if someone starts to engage in some pretty significant maladaptive behavior, my response is typically to walk away and try and find a staff person to A, let them know what's happening, and B, say, okay, is there anything I need to do differently? You know, am I the reason this is happening? Because that's not fair to that person. So we need to be aware of those things and see how our experiences drive those things in us, and certainly can for others as well. So it's very important for us to identify the triggers, identify the things for the individuals that can actually elicit those behaviors. So we need to look at that big time. So when you work with SST or any BCBA, typically we're going to try and have you fill out ABC data tracking or try and figure out what the function of the behavior is. And that's where those triggers become so important for us. It's so that we're able to understand what's happening in the environment that might be the cause of the behavior. Then we can understand why someone is doing what they're doing, and then hopefully figure out a way to help them through that. Once we've got that information, we're able to write far more detailed and better behavior plans that are much more likely to actually be not only effective at minimizing those maladaptive behaviors, but at the same time building up new behaviors that are more socially appropriate and much more useful to that individual. There might be times where we have to actually remove triggers. I am not a huge fan of exposure therapy. I know that's something that we've all probably seen to some extent, but it's not something that I've ever seen much success with. And a lot of the research that I've been exposed to makes it seem like in the short term, yes, maybe people will go ahead and do the thing they say they're afraid of. But the reality is it can cause a lot of depression and anxiety long term. So it's not necessarily the best idea. But sometimes what we need to do is once we identify those triggers, try and remove them as much as we can from the environment Certainly there will be some that we can remove or at least alter. Some, not so much. We all know that there's certain things that you have to have, like for example, in any setting, you have to have a fire alarm, right? That's not a choice. If that's a trigger for someone, we've got to figure out something else because we can't remove it. That's not a choice. So if you can, you try and remove or minimize those triggers so that you can have that safer, more positive environment, because once you've got that good steady base, then you can build upon it. But if someone is in that state of hyperarousal or being triggered all the time, you're not going to be able to get much done. What it really does is it helps to build build rapport, good grief, build rapport with staff, and then also repair that rapport with staff and reinforce all of those appropriate behaviors that we do want to see. It's also that moment where we can actually work on building new skills, because that person is at that bottom basement level, right? Where everything is calm, everything is good. We can build on those appropriate behaviors. And that positive environment really sort of gets rid of those instances where that person might need to use those problematic behaviors in order to feel safe and to feel good about themselves. And like I said, some things we can definitely remove, some things we can't. And so that's where we've got to figure out how do we then mitigate some of these triggers if we can't get rid of them, like a fire alarm, right? So you might figure out something else that works for that client. And certainly those should all be extremely specific to that person. So what does it all mean? Well, trauma-informed care is a lot. I'm not going to try and lie to anybody here and say this is super easy to implement and super easy to do. It is a heck of a lot of work. Initially, long-term, that's when you see people blossom and it's so worth it. But initially, yeah, it's a heck of a lot of work. Some of the principles here are super straightforward. Some are far more abstract because it does require just that much individualization. But what we need to do is, once we figured out the triggers, the person's history and their particular trauma, how they tend to respond to that trauma, so the behaviors they engage in, then we really have to sort of change our shift to talking about or working with the DSPs, the folks that are doing the work day in and day out with the individuals. This step is so critical, so critical. And unfortunately, I know it is just so hard right now, especially with staff turnover, because the amount of training that you have to do over and over and over again for new people starting to work in whatever setting you're in, it's a lot. It's a lot. But when we have our staff go through the training and learn who people are, really what we give them is an opportunity to learn how to assess people for that trauma or when they're feeling traumatized. And we're able to give them the tools they need to create that baseline of safe environment so that then they can work on those other skills. Because we all know, anybody who's ever worked in a DT or a group home setting or as a DSP or whatever, right, within the field, if everybody is safe, if everybody is calm, it's great because you can get so much done. But if there are big bad behaviors going on, it's chaos. Even if you've got a bunch of extra people there, it is just straight up chaos. I think we have 2 hours scheduled for today, and we've kind of hit the end of hour one. What I would like to do, if you guys don't mind, is take just a couple of minutes so that people can take a quick break. I'm going to drink some water and use the restroom myself. So let's say we try and come back at like 2:07. That's about 5 minutes. And in the meantime, while I'm gone for just a second, if anybody has any questions or comments or anything they want to put in the chat box, please feel free. I will definitely read those when I get back. And yeah, take 5 minutes for yourselves. Okay, guys, you're at 2:07. So we're going to hit the ground running again because I tend to be wordy. I'm worried about running out of time, which is extremely, extremely typical of me. So we are at the point where we are going to talk about a bit more about how do we actually apply this in the setting with the staff who are doing the work day to day so that they can do their best job for individuals. Because ultimately, if your DSPs are on it, if they know the information, if they are following the plans, things get a lot better. And that's really tough right now. It's really, really difficult right now. So let's talk a little bit more about the treatment principles and how we can actually apply those. We want to promote trauma awareness and understanding. If staff do not know that person's history, if they do not know what trauma they have experienced, they cannot possibly respond appropriately. So it is critical that step one is making sure staff know, right? In an ideal situation, you're going to have maybe a meeting before somebody moves into the group home and all of the staff are there, or you have multiple meetings or something along those lines and you talk about that person. Okay, so-and-so is moving in. Here's a little bit of their demographic information and here's the history that you should know about. During COVID, obviously that's not so easy. Also, that might not be something that financially you're able to do because you have to pay staff during that time. And again, times are tough. So what you need to do is make sure that you have the staff review that information in some way, shape, or form. It can be really important to either do it via Zoom or maybe make sure that they're filling in something that shows that they've had to have read the documents at least a little bit. Because again, the more information they have, the better they can do at actually understanding that person and what it is that they've been through. Recognize these symptoms and behaviors are not people being mean or treating staff poorly, that it's a response to something that happened in their past that had a pretty significant effect on them. You can kind of humanize the individuals that we're working with as well, so that we don't just see them as clients, but as people, and that can be helpful. View trauma through the context of people's environments. It always goes back first to the environment. What is it about this setting that's difficult? What is it about this setting that is triggering? We also want to minimize the risk of wow, that's a hard word today, re-traumatization, or replicating any of those things that were there for the prior trauma. So as much as we can, if we know that there's something that just isn't a good thing, we have to get rid of it. We have to do what we can to get rid of it. So we want to create that safe environment because that is our minimum standard. Safe. That's important. We want to help that individual recover from trauma as much as we can, knowing full well that none of us will ever fully recover from whatever trauma it is that we have anticipated, or excuse me, that we have experienced. But we're going to do what we can to help them get closer and closer and closer as time goes on. We want to support control, choice, and autonomy for the individuals who were victimized or who experienced the trauma, not necessarily staff having those things. But we also want to create collaborative relationships and opportunities where everybody gets the chance to participate and have a voice. And that's, again, why it is so important to really have the staff work with you on these things, because they may notice all sorts of little things that add up to be a big piece of who that person is and give us that understanding. So you have to have that rapport with staff so that they feel comfortable speaking up in those moments and saying, hey, I've noticed this. Is it something that we should care about? Is it something that we should be aware of? Is anybody else that's experiencing this? Familiarize your clients with any trauma-informed services that might be out there. If you have clinical staff within your agency that are able to do counseling, or counselors in the community that you know are a great resource. Figuring out even with the clients, just so they know if they're having a rough day, even if someone isn't clinical, who they can call or who they can talk to that can help them through whatever it is they're experiencing. I'm a firm believer in the letters in front of or behind your name, while important, are definitely not the be all end all. People's inherent skill set is more important. So if you have a staff person who is just really good at listening to people and helping them work through things, doesn't matter to me if they have the right degrees. If they can help people with that, it's an incredible skill and should be utilized. We also want to create some sort of a universal and routine trauma screening. And this needs to be done thoroughly before somebody comes to live at a group home or is enrolled in a DT setting. And then if it's something new that you're rolling out, do it with all of your existing clients. And I think it's really important when we do things that we talk very specifically with families or caregivers or guardians about what it is that that person might have experienced in their life. And we have to be very clear. I've been to lots of meetings where I might just say, has this person experienced trauma in their life? And everyone says no. And then when I start to dig just a little bit deeper, just ask a couple of more questions like, oh, well, have they ever been physically abused? Or have they ever experienced sexual abuse? Or has anyone very important to them passed away? You get flooded with information that's like, okay, here's trauma in that person's life. Here's something that could have had a huge impact on them. And a lot of times you'll actually see a pretty clear correlation between some of the behaviors in those events. So it's not just enough to ask, hey, what trauma did they have in their life? Because everyone's version of trauma is different. You have to dig a little bit deeper. And having that universal screening tool can be really helpful at just hitting the basics. But I think it's important to not just do that and then push it to the side. It's paperwork that you need to actually use. You need to review it. You need to ask follow-up questions. It needs to be something that is really truly informing services. We also want to view trauma through a sociocultural lens. What is trauma in our culture might be different in a totally different culture. So we have to do our best to work towards being anti-racist and to be advocates for people with completely different backgrounds from our own, and viewing things through that lens and how that lens might be radically different than our own. Use a strengths-focused perspective. We want to promote resilience, right? And it's not important that people are always strong and resilient. We're allowed to fall apart. Every single one of us is. But we also want to promote it and help teach people how to be more resilient. That's important. Foster those trauma-resistant skills so that when people are exposed to triggers, that they have more resistance and resilience to begin with, so that when they're exposed to those things, they know how to handle them or can handle them better than they could the day before. Show an organizational and administrative commitment to trauma-informed care. I said it earlier, and I'll say it a million more times if I need to. If this isn't something that everybody buys in from the top down, it's never going to go anywhere. It's not enough for just a couple of people to really champion this. It has to be everyone. And then when you can get everybody on board, it's incredible what you're able to do. You want to also address lots of strategies to address secondary trauma and promote self-care, and not just with that individual, but with other people in the home or the DT, and also with staff and with yourself. And I'll be honest, I could talk about self-care and secondary trauma all day. In fact, I have at least 2 presentations on it. It's a topic, those are topics that I'm extremely passionate about. And they have become just that much more important to me throughout the last 18 months, where we've all had to really pivot repeatedly with what it is that we're doing. But we'll save that for another day, not today. And then also provide hope that some level of recovery is possible. That if you are working with someone whose trauma is so deep and they instantly automatically go to that deep, dark place every single time, there is hope that someday it could get better. And that's what we're here to do, is to help work on that, so that maybe when you experience those emotions and those feelings all over again, instead of feeling them as deep as possible, it gets a little better every time, and teaching them those new skills. So one of the things that we've talked about is creating that safe environment. It's more than just making sure that people are safe from abuse and neglect. That's a really, truly bare minimum standard, but it's a feeling where people are at ease and comfortable. We want to make sure that it is just an accessible environment to everyone. It is not just physically safe, but also emotionally safe, where people have the ability and skill set to be able to contact someone when they need assistance. And when I say contact and communicate, of course, whatever it is that works for that individual, but in a safe way, so that they're not going to be treated poorly, but that they're going to get a reaction from staff that is actually helpful to them. And I do have, not only in this slide, but some other slides, and then at the end I have a bunch of resources for you guys as well, because there's a lot of great information on this. But we really need to be sure that we're creating that safe environment. And safe isn't just physical safety, but it's a start, right? So the first infographic here shows an individual who is utilizing a wheelchair. That's a really great one, right? If you are working with someone who uses some type of adaptive equipment, whether that be a wheelchair, or if they need a different spoon while they're eating, or adult undergarments, whatever it is that that person needs, we have to ensure that the environment that they are in meets those needs. That's just the bare minimum. And I know that most of our environments are going to be pretty ADA compliant, just because we have to go through a number of safety regulations and fire marshal inspections and whatnot. But especially, you know, for someone whose needs might be as visible as utilizing a wheelchair, we have to make sure, are there ramps to be able to get out of the physical environment that they are in? Are there stairs within the home that means the home is no longer accessible to them? We have to change those things up. And if it's, say, someone who needs a spoon, a different spoon, there need to be multiple of those spoons. They need to be in every environment. It might be that that person carries some sort of a backpack or a purse or a bag with them, and they keep one with them at all times so that they have what they need to navigate the world. We want to do that so that people feel that they can be independent as much as possible. We also want to identify the triggers and either eliminate them or minimize them. And that brings me back to the woman I spoke about first, who was was utilizing a wheelchair, and staff couldn't touch her from behind or the side. So she was someone who had some ambulatory skills, but certainly needed assistance for certain things. Say, for example, when she was going to utilize the toilet, or when she was going to shower or get into her bed, staff needed to assist her for that ambulation. And so staff were always going to have to touch her. This was just going to be a part of her life. So we can never take away the trigger of people touching her. So what we had to do is minimize it. So how did we do that? Some real world things, right? No one ever approached her from the side or behind, as much as possible. The behind, never, ever, 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 ever. The side and the front as well, what we recommended is that you would always try and be face to face with her. But as there will be situations where you have to be on the side of her, what you had to do was ensure that you said her name a couple of times to the point where she actually looked at you and made eye contact, especially with her dementia, as that became more of a situation towards the end of her life several years later. We wanted to make sure that she was in fact hearing you and physically saw your presence there. And then some of the next things that we implemented with her, and I strongly recommend for any and all individuals, which is pretty much most of our folks, who need assistance with like ADLs that require staff to touch them or to bathe them or assist with those sort of things. Staff need to tell people what they're going to do. And they also need to ask permission. We have to normalize the idea that people have autonomy over their own bodies, just like we do. So for example, if you were to be in a store, just shopping for groceries, let's say you're at the grocery store, right? And someone walked up to you and took you by the shoulders, even gently, and moved you to the side. You didn't know them. They didn't say, excuse me. They didn't tell you what they were going to do. They just touched you and moved you to the side. I would imagine that most of us are not going to be pretty comfortable with that. In fact, some of us might get to that fight, flight, or freeze space, right? I would like to think that I'd actually look at that person and have a few words that were polite but clear. Don't touch me. I didn't give you permission to touch me. If you needed something, please say excuse me instead. Me, knowing me, I'd probably just look at them with a look on my face. It's like, seriously, what just happened to me? But it's important for us to do that for one another. So it is also important for us to do that for individuals that we're working with, even if it is completely normal for them to require total care from their staff. They are owed, at a bare minimum, staff telling them what they're going to be doing. And that also can really, really, really help with people understanding that they have the right to say no, especially to protect them from sexual abuse. So if you are working with someone who, let's say, showering and bathing and hygiene in general is just not a skill set, right? It's something they require a great deal of care. It is important for staff to say, hey, Joe, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a shower and I'm going to bathe you. That means I'm going to have a wash rag and it's going to have soap on it. And I'm going to start bathing your arms first and then your torso and then your legs. And we're also going to bathe your privates. but give that person the opportunity to say yes or no. Give them some autonomy over their own body. And so that they understand what is and isn't okay and what is and isn't safe. That's also really important because it creates such an opportunity for staff to build rapport with the individuals that they work with. So that if they are experiencing something that is triggering for them, or they're not having a good day, or whatever it is, they feel safer to tell their staff. They feel safer to communicate however they can that things are not okay. So we need to try and do that. That's a huge, huge thing that we can start working on. And the reality is a lot of that doesn't need to take very much time, particularly once you start doing it routinely. The individuals themselves will know what's coming next, and you can just say, hey, we're going to do our bath. We're going to do this, that, and the other. And the person is like, cool, let's do this. So it's important to do that. We also are going to teach individuals skills, how to cope with those triggering situations as much as we can. Lori, I don't know that I actually have a specific measure that I recommend. I have really good ones for staff, to be honest, for staff and for self-care and compassion fatigue and things like that. I'm not sure that I have a great one that I feel like is all encompassing within like a group home or a DT setting, which is where I'm assuming that you've worked. And again, I'm still getting messages that people have raised their hands. If you raise your hand, I'm not going to be able to get to. I need you to put in the chat box what you would like to talk about. But Lori, I can do a bit more research on that and see if there's something that I feel like is a better option. I know that some places and some agencies have a very strong feeling about which one they use, and it might be something they develop themselves. So safe means responsive to all of these needs of the individuals. That's really important. It also means consistency. Again, I know we can't be perfectly consistent all the time. That's just not a realistic expectation. I'm not consistent day to day, much less, 3 different shifts of staff, multiple staff sometimes too. So we do need to think about how is it that we can help put this trauma-informed care philosophy into practice. Again, getting to the DSPs, getting to the staff, the ones that are doing that work day in and day out. How do we get people, and they're called residential counselors on this slide, but really DSPs, to care more about the residents? Not that they don't care, I want to make that clear, but how do we give them that extra insight into that person so they have just a little bit more, an extra level of compassion or an extra level of understanding, even for the people that are the most difficult? Because I'll be honest, I know that I am the outlier when I am working with someone who's got massive behaviors and difficulties. That's my jam. That's what I'm meant to do. But that's not the average DSP per se. None of us really truly signed up to be in a field or in a job where you might be physically assaulted on a regular basis. That's not what we want. That's a lot of my clients. It's the job I've chosen, but that's not necessarily what staff sign up for. So how do we make the individuals themselves someone that they can relate to a bit more? And then how do we teach new staff to be more likable and compassionate as well? Some staff are just naturally gifted at this. Others are going to need more work. And so how do we teach them those things? And then if staff are disengaged, if they're not doing as good a quality as work as we would prefer them to do, what can we do as a team to get them more engaged, to make this job more meaningful to them? So safe means that we have staff that are very supportive and supporting. We want staff to be good at their jobs, number one, right? It's less work for all of the rest of us in the meantime. If staff know what they're up to, it is way less work. And those skills can be taught most of the time. So we want to be sure that we are putting ourselves in the situation where we have created rapport with those staff members. If we are someone who shows up once a month, once every 2 weeks, very, very infrequently, odds are staff don't really know us. So if we do actually have to be there that infrequently, because sometimes that is reality, it is important for us to really try and create a personal connection with that staff person, to really get to know who they are, to do our best, even if you're crap at it, remember that person's name. That is a great skill, and it can go a long, long way. The places where I've had the most success, the clients where I have had the most success, almost every single time, it comes down to, was I able to get staff buy-in? Was I able to get this particular DT room to really just buy what I was selling and try it. And then be open to say to them point blank, again, I know some stuff about behavior. I don't know everything about this person. I want you to give this a try. And I want you to give it a try for this long. And if it doesn't work, we will work on changing it together. I want your feedback. I want to know what is or isn't working. And then actually following through with all of that, not just saying it, but meaning it. That can make all the difference in the world. And so much of what this comes down to is not only our rapport with staff, but our ability to help set up good rapport with individuals so that everybody has good rapport. We have good rapport with staff, we have good rapport with individuals, and individuals and staff have great rapport as well. That rapport is so critical on so many levels. We can really look at how staff are interacting with clients to figure out if there's a good rapport or if there's rapport that needs to be built upon. Bribes are something we don't want to do. And I want to make it clear, the difference between a bribe and what we would consider to be like reinforcement or something like a token program. A bribe is, I'll give you this, but you have to do this for me. So you get the reward before the behavior, as opposed to token programs or reinforcement, which is someone engages in the appropriate behavior and then they're rewarded. Okay. So bribes are not generally a good thing. That's not something we want. We also want to be sure that staff are not threatening individuals in any way, shape, or form. That is never going to be a good thing. And sometimes that can be really, really minuscule. Someone even muttering it under their breath. So we want to be aware of that. We also want to have lots of social support, because the environment that staff work in, that should also be something that we're trying to make sure is safe as well. Because if staff feel safe, they're more likely to be able to do their jobs well, because just like the individuals have trauma, so do we. And something that the staff might be experiencing within the group home is triggering for them as well. So we want to have those strong relationships. And that we need to have reminders of why things like reinforcement and punishment, and I'm really using those in the behavior and analysis way, why those things are necessary, that we have to have incentives to do the work, to do the right work. And every single person on this training right now, unless you are retired, is on a token program currently, and it's your paycheck, right? You do the work that you're supposed to do, and then whatever schedule you have, you receive your reinforcement, which is money. And then you get to utilize it however the heck you want, right? It's a token program. And the same thing goes with the individuals that we work with. We can create those token program systems with them that essentially become like a paycheck, so that we are reinforcing all of that appropriate behavior. And then on some rare occasions, we might have what we call a response cost, which is where if they engage in a behavior we don't want, there's a cost to that system. But we want to be sure that we're providing staff with so many tools so that they can have those good relationships. And sometimes that can be as simple as having a staff meeting and giving staff the opportunity to vent for a little bit about working with someone who's difficult. I do tons and tons of training with staff. That's something that we at SST spend a lot of our time doing, and it's lovely. And I don't have a problem at all with spending the first 10 or 15 minutes easily venting about the person. Sometimes when you let staff do that, you can learn so much about not only the individual themselves, but the things that are really troublesome for the staff in the home, and the things about your plan that may not be working. So you have to be able to build that rapport. You have to be able to give people that opportunity to express themselves. The emphasis with trauma-informed care is on that client history. If we don't know that client history, we are starting behind the 8 ball. Now, there will be times where we will never be able to find all that history, especially if someone has moved maybe state to state, or even been in a particular setting for a long time. Everybody knows that client so well that that history's sort of been lost because it's in everyone's brains, but they move somewhere else, so no one knows anymore. So client history is so important, because we have to consider, what if that person was raised in the foster system, and so they've had a number of different homes or a number of different facilities? That paperwork could be lost. What about if the abuse is unknown? I worked with a gentleman for several times now, who I don't know what it is about the bathroom and showering, but he is an extremely docile, wonderful gentleman until it's time for a shower. And it doesn't seem to matter or especially when we first started to work with him. It didn't seem to matter what the temperature of the water was, because we tried lots of different variables there and let him sort of give us an indicator, because he's not super verbal, of what temperature he preferred. He didn't seem to care if it was the shower or the bath. But if he was in a bathroom with a staff person, particularly a smaller female, it was going to be difficult to shower or bathe him. And the truth is, I think, given everything that I know about his family history, that abuse occurred in the bathroom. And I'm not talking about sexual abuse, I'm talking physical abuse. I have a strong feeling, based on some of the things that I know, that there was physical abuse in the bathroom, specifically related to showering. And that's what's going on, is that sort of a re-traumatization for him every time. So we've been able to put together some procedures for him that include, ideally, the staff person who is helping him, because he does require some assistance to clean himself well. Here's some ways we're going to keep him a bit protected, right? They're not necessarily going to be doing the work for this gentleman. They will coach him through it, but stand, 1.5 arm lengths away. That ideally it's going to be a male staff member. If not reasonable, then it's going to be a female who is a stature that is not like his mother. Because people who remind him of his mother or are similar to his mother seem to, unfortunately, be people who experience more difficulties with him. And so we don't know what his history is exactly. We have made some assumptions based on some of what we do know, but we don't know all of it. So we've put those pieces together to make things better, because he can't get rid of hygiene, right? It's not a choice for him to never shower or bathe again. But we're trying to make it as good as we can. We've also worked on having a lot of visuals so that he's not as dependent upon staff telling him what to do. There's consistent visuals so that staff can say, look at this picture, or look at step 2, whatever it is that we're doing at the moment, to work with him, because that can be really, really helpful. And sometimes you might be in a situation where someone is actually protecting the abuser. It's unfortunate, but this happens a lot. And you will see families rally around the abuser rather than the person who has been abused, or shame the victim themselves into silence. And so these are things that we need to be aware of and on alert for, because they might be what's going on. But again, I think it's also really important to not go ahead and assume that things are abuse. Because, people have gotten things wrong in the past, certainly. Okay, a little bit more about trauma screening and some things that we should be looking at. This is not as specific as what you were hoping for, Lori, but here's some, sort of things to look at first. Does that person have any of those trauma-related symptoms that we talked about earlier, right? That list is not exhaustive, but if you go grab like a DSM, you can look through depressive symptoms and trauma-related things and get an idea of what those might look like. Does the person have sleep disturbances? Sometimes sleep disturbances, particularly significant shifts in someone's sleeping patterns, can in fact be a sign of trauma. Do they have past and present mental disorders, particularly PTSD or anything trauma-related? What are the type and the characteristics of their trauma? Like, what does their trauma actually look like? Is there substance abuse in their history? I know that's not particularly common within the field that we work in, but it isn't unknown. It is something that I've seen a couple of times. And I've known some people that actually needed to go to like a rehab setting to detox and to learn some different skill sets. So we need to know about substance abuse, not just with that person though, but also within the family. Because certainly when you are not necessarily in your right mind, you might do things that are traumatic or harmful to others. We also want to look at what that person's life is like in terms of social support. And then, do they have any coping skills currently? What do those look like? What is it that they are actually using in the moment to help cope with whatever it is that they're dealing with? And then, what resources do you have available in your area? I know that during the pandemic, going out and doing things in person has in fact been extremely difficult. But I know that a lot of different licensure boards have actually allowed people to continue telehealth and are sort of considering doing it indefinitely, because if you're in an area that is more resource deprived, right? If you're in a very rural area, there's certainly parts of my territory in central Illinois where the resources aren't quite so plentiful. If you can do things via telehealth and it's still effective, that's a tremendous resource to have at your disposal. And then also look at, what are the risks within their life right now, or how they're living that could lead to self-harm, to suicide, and to violence. Suicide within our population is far, far, far more rare than the typical population. And generally that is felt to be simply because of the lack of access to items. Because inherently, if you're living in a group home setting, typically they're staffing 24/7 and people are watching out for things. So it is a far more difficult thing for that to actually occur, although it certainly does. And then health screenings as well. And this is so, so critical. It's not fun to go to the doctor sometimes. It's not fun to be poked and prodded, but they can literally save your life and help you learn things. I wasn't with SST at the time, but my boss tells a story on a regular basis. One of the very first cases we got within his team's territory was a young woman who was pretty agoraphobic. She wasn't leaving her home. In fact, she wasn't even leaving her room, and hadn't in many, 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 many years. And her family was just desperate for assistance. They were just wonderful, wonderful parents. And eventually, throughout the course of the case, they were able to get her out and just do some basic care with doctors, because that was our first priority. But she hasn't seen doctors in years. We need to establish a new baseline for her. And we were able to get her to a couple of doctors, and I can't remember specifically if she saw an OBGYN or they just did all of the things involved with that yearly appointment at her PCP. But they did find out that she had cervical cancer. And I think it was either cervical or ovarian cancer. And I apologize, it's not my case, so I don't remember all the specifics. But when they were able to do more information gathering and some testing to sort of find out, how far along was this situation, how far had it spread, where did it come from? The short version is that she had contracted, I believe it was HPV, and it had mutated into causing cancer. And her family was absolutely stunned, because how would she have contracted HPV? She wasn't sexually active with anyone. And then through some more investigation, they were able to find out that there had been a family member who had been abusing her. And that's where she got it. And that's how she had gotten cancer. And unfortunately, her cancer was quite intense and involved. And so she didn't survive for much longer. But those health screenings can be that important, because had anyone been able to work with her sooner, maybe we could have caught this a lot earlier, and the person that was doing this to her would have been out of her life a lot sooner. So it's really, really critical that we screen for all of these things. I have lots of times where I will routinely ask about, when was the last time that person was screened for any sort of STDs or STIs? Those are super important too, just to know, certainly because most of them can actually cure at this point or mitigate the symptoms. So it's important for us to know that, specifically for people who have had sexual abuse in their history. It's just so critical. So let's talk about some training for caregivers as well. So what we want to do when we're training caregivers and DSPs, and then know for ourselves as well, because I know that there are a lot of people right now who, because you are short-staffed within your homes, you are pulling extra shifts and doing the DSP work on top of your regular responsibilities. What are some of the training pieces that we need to focus on? We need to train people on acknowledging triggers. What are those triggers? What do they look like for that person? What are some things we might see next? What are the precursor behaviors? And this is so important for de-escalation, right? We all know when things have hit the fan. Everybody knows what that looks like for that individual. And you're all probably picturing someone on your caseload who when things have hit the fan and what that person is going to do. But more often than not, there are some precursor behaviors. There are some little things ahead of time, triggers or signals from that person to let you know that things are going to get escalated. And that's that moment to intervene. That's the moment where staff need to step up and do the de-escalation work. Because once you get to that place where someone is behaving in that way, you're in trouble, right? It's bad. So we want to look at all of those things so that staff are very aware of those things. They know what they look like. They know how to respond. I am a huge, huge proponent of every single agency having staff trained in some sort of formal de-escalation program. Even if you're an agency that chooses not to teach your staff any sort of hands-on procedures, whether you use safety care, CPI, MANT, or any other variation that's out there, there's always major components of those programs that are just exclusively de-escalation and hands-off. And I think all staff should be trained in that. I think it's really important to give staff those tools so that they know how to handle those situations. Staff and caregivers need to provide lots of reinforcement, particularly for those behaviors we're trying to see more of. Within behavior plans, we are not just trying to get rid of bad behaviors, we're trying to reinforce the good ones and build up on the good ones. So staff need to know exactly what those good ones look like and then reinforce the heck out of them so that they occur more often. We also need to work on how to adjust the amount of triggers that people are being exposed to. Again, some triggers you're always going to have in your life. You're not going to be able to get rid of them. But how do we expose them to those things in a way that they have the support they need, that they can respond in a way that allows them to work through it before it ends up being worse? So one of the things that we have to work with staff on, especially because our DSPs aren't just doing one thing at a time, right? They are multitasking constantly, and none of them are sitting around eating bonbons, watching TV. That's not their life. We really want to work on active listening, how to listen to the individuals that you're working with, how to watch what it is that they're doing to understand if things are okay or not. So we want to teach them about things like eye contact and body language and your vocal qualities. All of those things are super, super important in how people are going to interact with you and whether or not you're going to be successful. And we all probably know a lot about this inherently, but I think it's important to go over it and review it with staff on a regular basis, because it's easy to sort of get stuck in the day-to-day and not realize how our behavior is maybe impacting the people that we are working with. So, and I know we're getting towards the end of our time, so this is going to go a little fast. We want to be sure that we are providing people with eye contact, and not a ton to the point where it's creepy, right? You're not staring at people, but provide them with eye contact and assume that as the listener, we are going to give far more eye contact than we receive back. Because when people are talking about topics that are uncomfortable or maybe people that they're not so sure that they have that rapport with, the eye contact is not going to be as significant. That's okay. That is not the be all end all. I know that for a long time, there was a push even within BCBA services that we needed to teach eye contact. I don't believe that we need to. It's nice when we've got it, but people can listen to you without actually looking at you as well. So eye contact, well, it's nice. It's not a critical thing unless you are the person who is listening, and then it is critical. Because if not, staff are probably, like I said, doing 2 or 3 other things at once and only half listening. And if someone is only half listening to you while you're talking about things that are difficult for you, or you were trying to tell them what you're feeling and experiencing, you're less likely to do it in the future because they don't seem to care. Some things that we might see, physiological things, right? Our pupils dilate when something is interesting to the person, contract or become smaller when they are uncomfortable or bored. So staff can watch for that with the individuals they're working with. And just know that people, when they're talking about a distressing topic, the eye contact is not as significant. They're not going to give you as much eye contact. It's just not something they're going to be able to do. But us providing eye contact is important because we're showing that person that we are listening and that what they're saying is important to us, which is so critical for establishing and maintaining rapport. Body language, it's so critical. So much of what we say has absolutely nothing to do with the words. It has to do with body language. It has to do with tone. It has to do with volume. So we have to be aware of how our body language does or does not help us in situations. So we need to make sure that we're keeping people at a comfortable and conversational distance. Here it's listed a little more than an arm's length for social distancing purposes. We all know that we should be trying to be 6 feet away, no matter what your status is, as far as whether or not you have COVID or you're vaccinated. Right now, we just should all be extra cautious. Be aware of what that client's movements are like. If they are moving closer to you, and that tends to be a signal that might be aggressive, or if they're moving farther away. If they're moving farther away, it might be that they feel like they need to have distance. They don't feel safe. And you're going to know your clients pretty well. Some people are close talkers. Some people are always right here, right at your side. So if they're doing something different and they're staying farther away, that's a pretty big indicator of whether or not they're comfortable. So know those things about your people, and then also know what's comfortable and what's natural for you. And I think it's important for staff to know that they have the opportunity and the right to tell people, hey, could you please step back a little bit? I feel more comfortable when you step back a little bit, especially if you can do it in a very nice, calm, neutral way. Individuals will learn that then they have the right to say that back to you, so that if you're doing something for them that they don't feel comfortable with, there's that give and take in that relationship. That rapport exists. Vocal qualities. We need to notice the pitch, volume, and rate of speech that we are using, as well as the individual. Right now, I'm trying to not speak super quickly because I keep looking at the time and I'm like, oh God, we're almost out of time. I gotta go. But we want to try, when we are working with our individuals, to have a nice calm rate of speech so that they don't have to feel rushed, so that they don't have to feel hurried, particularly in those moments where they are being vulnerable or they're already triggered. And it's important for us as staff to emulate that back, because people will often imitate without even realizing it what the other person is doing. If you happen to be around someone who is highly agitated, you may become more agitated. So you have to take that second within yourself and step back and say, okay, this is how I want this person to speak to me. This is what I need to give to them. And then know what works best for your individuals. Some people do not respond well to loud voices. Some people are triggered by that. Know what works for them. Verbal tracking skills, which is like staying on topic. If someone constantly shifts the topic, especially when you try and talk about the really hard stuff, it could be that they're uncomfortable. It could be that you're hitting a little too close to the trauma as far as what they're comfortable talking about in the moment. You need to, though, as staff, let that person know that you're understanding and hearing what they're saying. They may be repeating key phrases or summarizing what they just said to you, repeating it back to them, so that if you have misunderstood and if you're not understanding that, sort of what they really want you to understand, that you are going ahead and letting them know what you're taking from that conversation, so that if you're wrong, they have the opportunity to let you know. The other thing is, you don't always have to talk. Sometimes just sitting with someone and supporting them silently can be really, really powerful. In fact, we're dealing with a gentleman right now who's really fantastic, but he was just at a funeral yesterday, and we happened to have a skills session with him not long after the funeral. And repeatedly, he just didn't seem like he really wanted to talk so much. And we would just say, well, do you want to be done with this conversation? Would you like to be finished with it? And he would say no. And so we'd say, okay, would you like to just sit here quietly? And then if you want to talk, you can let us know. And his eyes lit up and he said, yes, that's what I want to do. And then it was really amazing. Once we did that a couple of times, we got so much done, just so much done, because we let him know that it's okay. You don't have to talk all the time. If you need just a minute to yourself to gather your thoughts, no issue. That's fine with us too. We also want to work on asking both open-ended and closed-end questions. Ideally, if someone is really, really open or has some great verbal skills, using a lot of open-ended questions is preferred, simply because it gives them the opportunity to express more of what it is that they are experiencing. But for some of our individuals, that might not be great. They may not be able to do that. We also don't want to inundate people with too much conversation, especially when we're discussing really difficult topics. If we're constantly asking question after question after question, it feels like an interrogation, and that's not comfortable for anyone. So we want to ask lots of questions, but do so in a way that's comfortable. Watch all of those other vocal qualities that we talked about, body language things out of people, because it's pretty clear when they're not comfortable anymore. Responding. We need to give responses to people. We talked about that a little bit with being an active listener, that you're paraphrasing and summarizing what people have said, but there's other things that you can do in the meantime. You can nod your head, you can make eye contact, you can say, that's a really great way to let somebody know that you are in fact paying attention to them, especially maybe in those moments where staff are doing two things at once and they can't stop the other thing that they're doing in that moment, right? If they're in the middle of dinner and they have to pull something out of the oven right then, or it's going to burn, they have to do that while they're still listening to the other person. I know there are times where if I happen to get an email and I'm talking to one of my staff, and there's a lull in the conversation real quickly, and I see that the email's from someone that I probably will look at, I'll say, can you give me just a moment to check this email and make sure it's not a crisis? Just even saying that, then looking at my email quickly and then letting them know where my attention is going to be next can really help, so that they feel that they are important because they are. We are not going to have much time to do the rest of this, but that's okay. We'll hit it real quick. We also want to work with staff on validation. And validation doesn't mean that you have to agree with the person. It just means that you are trying to let them know that you understand what it is that they're feeling. You have some empathy for what it is that they're feeling, and that their feelings are valid. So if someone says, this job sucks, and God knows we probably all said that about our own job, right? If we're being very real. It's okay. I have days where I look at my job and go, what am I doing for a living? What is this job? Because it's chaos, right? And it's crazy, especially during a pandemic. It's okay to say that. And we'll say to one another, you're right, today's a rough day. And then maybe later we can refocus on what are the good aspects of our job, because there always are good things. But it's okay in that moment to just say, yeah, some days this job really isn't great. Some days this job is extremely difficult. Boy, just a tiny little bit on compassion fatigue. Again, this is an area that I have multiple presentations on. I love it so much. It is really important for us, because we give so much of ourselves to others, we need, yes, Kayla, you're right. We need to also be aware of our own resiliency and how much we have left to give of ourselves. And it is important for us to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others. It sounds selfish sometimes, but doing things for yourself isn't selfish, it's self-care. Because if you don't sustain yourself, you cannot possibly help others. Our jobs are important. What we do is important. Every single one of us is valuable to this field. And so it is really critical that we do some things to take care of ourselves. And I really wish I could talk more about that. I think it's just so important, but it's important for us to sustain our professional selves, because some days it's tough. We want to remember the meaning of our work. We want to give ourselves some understanding too. We cannot be at 100% all of the time. We can't. It's not realistic. Some days we have to say, you know what, for today, that's as much as I have to give. That's the best I can do. Is it perfect? No. We cannot be perfect all the time. And I say that, and God, it's a whole lot easier to say than it is to put into practice, I promise. But those are things that we need to work on, as well as knowing our own stressors, knowing the things that we know are triggers for us, whether it's trauma related for ourselves or if they're just stressors in general for us. So know those things and be aware of how they can affect you and how they can affect the rest of your work as well. Okay, we have about 6 minutes left. So some housekeeping things. We have some really good resources here for you guys to be able to look at. And let me see, I'm going to go ahead and write in my email address, as well as Anna's. So if you have questions about future trainings from us, or you want more information, like you didn't get the slides for some reason, or you've got questions about your CEUs after a couple of weeks, Anna's the person to email, but of course, feel free to email me as well, not a problem. Do you guys, yes, Carl, you can't save others if you forget how to swim. Absolutely, absolutely. Does anybody have questions or comments? I do believe that Anna typically sends out a survey after or before, now that I think about it, these trainings. So please feel free to provide feedback. It really helps us improve our skills, and it helps us improve these presentations so that we can give you guys even better info. Karen, personally, I have not tried EMDR. I am not certified in it, but I do have a staff person in our Hillside office that is, and he's tried it with people. And our success rate sort of depends on that individual and sort of the particular setting that they're in, and lots of other circumstances. But yes, we've seen some great success with EMDR, and it's so interesting to me. I feel like it's something I definitely want to learn more about. But yeah, we've seen it. Thanks for all the feedback, guys. I appreciate it. I'll stay on for a couple of minutes. I have another meeting at 3, so right at 3, I'm going to have to hop off. But again, if anybody has any questions or comments, do not hesitate to let me know. If you have specific scenarios that you want a little assistance with, shoot me an email. If I can help, if I can point you in the right direction, I'm happy to do so. Hey, Lisa. Thank you guys. I appreciate you coming today, especially right before another big holiday. You know, life is crazy right now. Thank you, Kelly. Thanks, Lisa. Hey, John. It's so nice to see familiar faces or names because I don't see faces right now. Thank you, Melinda. You as well. Thanks, Ramon. I appreciate it. Thank you, Erica. You as well. Thanks, Angela. I really appreciate that. All right, guys, I'm going to sign off so that I can hop on my next meeting, but have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful week. And if you celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas and happy holidays for everyone else. I will see you all soon, hopefully in person one of these days. My goodness.